On July 1, 2024, the United States Supreme Court delivered a decision that was immediately framed in contradictory terms. A defeat for some, a victory for others. The ruling concerned Donald Trump's claim of absolute presidential immunity from criminal prosecution. While headlines captured the rejection of this sweeping claim, the true significance of the decision lies not in a simple verdict, but in its complex and far-reaching consequences. This was not a final knockout blow, but a fundamental reshaping of the legal and political battlefield, setting in motion a chain of events that directly impacts the integrity of the 2024 presidential election cycle. As an analyst of legal and political systems, my objective here is not to provide an opinion, but to deconstruct the mechanics of this landmark ruling. We will examine how a decision that, on its face, limited presidential power, simultaneously delivered a major procedural victory to the former president. The central thesis of our analysis is that the Supreme Court established a new, complicated legal standard that effectively delays criminal accountability. This outcome was not an accident, but a direct consequence of the court's specific intervention, creating a lasting precedent on the limits of executive authority in the United States. The core of the issue is a paradox. The court affirmed that no president is completely above the law by rejecting the concept of absolute immunity. Yet in practice, the solution it created, a lengthy, multi-step process for lower courts to follow, handed Donald Trump his single greatest strategic asset: time. This ruling introduced a new legal distinction between a president's official acts and private acts, a distinction the Supreme Court itself did not resolve. Instead, it sent the case back to the trial court, initiating a new phase of legal battles guaranteed to consume months, if not longer. This decision did not occur in a vacuum. It stands at the center of a series of criminal indictments against a former president, who is also the leading candidate for a major political party. The most prominent of these is the federal case brought by special counsel Jack Smith, which accuses Trump of conspiring to overturn the 2020 election. Before the Supreme Court's intervention, lower courts had forcefully rejected the immunity claim, with the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals stating plainly that former presidents possess no special protection from federal criminal liability. The Supreme Court's choice to even hear the case was the first crucial delay. To fully comprehend the structural impact of this ruling, our analysis will proceed in a clear, logical sequence. First, we will dissect the legal machinery of presidential immunity, explaining the new two-tiered test the court created. Next, we will examine the institutional function of the Supreme Court, clarifying why its role is to set legal rules rather than determine guilt or innocence. Finally, we will trace the concrete, real-world consequences of this decision, demonstrating how the judicial calendar was effectively subordinated to the political clock, with profound implications for the 2024 election and the future of executive accountability. Understanding the intricate layers of this event is essential for any citizen seeking to grasp the forces shaping the nation's legal and political future. This analysis is designed to provide clarity on the system, the process, and the direct consequences of the court's actions. If you find this kind of detailed, fact-based breakdown valuable, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and contribute to the discussion in the comments section below. Our examination begins with the legal doctrine at the heart of the conflict, the concept of presidential immunity itself. To understand the Supreme Court's decision, we must first deconstruct the legal machinery at its core, the doctrine of presidential immunity. This concept is not explicitly written into the U.S. Constitution. Instead, it has evolved through case law, most notably the 1982 case, Nixon v. Fitzgerald. That ruling established that presidents have absolute immunity from civil lawsuits related to their official duties. The court reasoned that a president must be able to execute their responsibilities without the constant fear of retaliatory or harassing litigation. This precedent, however, left a critical question unanswered. Does this shield extend to criminal prosecution? The distinction between civil and criminal liability is fundamental. The Nixon v. Fitzgerald decision was designed to protect the office of the president from being bogged down by private lawsuits seeking monetary damages. It ensured that a president's policy decisions would not lead to personal financial ruin. But the threat of criminal charges, brought by the state for alleged violations of law, operates on a completely different plane. For decades, the judiciary had not been forced to draw a clear line on whether a former president could be criminally prosecuted for actions taken while in the Oval Office. Donald Trump's legal team advanced an argument for absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. Their position was that a president, to function effectively, must be entirely shielded from the threat of criminal charges for any act committed while in office. They contended that without such total protection, the presidency itself would be fundamentally weakened. This claim sought to expand the civil immunity established in the Nixon era into an impenetrable barrier against all forms of criminal accountability, presenting it as a necessary safeguard for the executive branch's power and independence. The central rationale for this sweeping claim was the paralyzed president theory. According to this argument, if a president could be prosecuted by a subsequent administration, they would become timid and indecisive, unable to make the tough, controversial calls required by the job. The fear of political retribution, disguised as legal action, would hang over every decision, from foreign policy to domestic enforcement. In this view, absolute immunity was not a personal perk for the individual, but an essential structural protection for the institution of the presidency itself, ensuring its continued strength and operational capacity. On July 1, 2024, the Supreme Court delivered a nuanced answer that reshaped this entire debate. In its ruling, the court explicitly rejected the argument for absolute immunity, stating that no president is completely above the law. However, it simultaneously created a new, more complex standard of qualified immunity. The decision established a two-tiered test that lower courts must now apply. This framework requires separating a president's actions into two categories: official acts, which are immune from prosecution, and private acts, which are not. This distinction is now the central legal battleground. Under this new test, official acts are those that fall within the scope of a president's constitutional duties and powers. These are the core functions of the executive office, such as signing or vetoing legislation, commanding the military, or issuing pardons and executive orders. The court affirmed that a president cannot be criminally prosecuted for performing these legitimate, constitutionally grounded responsibilities. This part of the ruling provided a significant shield for future presidents, ensuring they can carry out their formal duties without fear of politically motivated charges arising from their policy decisions or official commands. In direct contrast, the court ruled that private acts receive no such protection. The ruling suggests that actions taken for personal enrichment, to advance a political campaign, or to unlawfully remain in power, do not qualify as official presidential duties. These are considered to be outside the constitutional authority granted to the executive, and therefore they are not shielded by presidential immunity. Even if these actions are taken while the president is in office and using the resources of the White House, their private nature makes them subject to potential criminal prosecution. To clarify this abstract legal line, the distinction can be illustrated with clear examples. An official act would be the issuing of an executive order to address a national security threat, a clear exercise of presidential authority. A private act, on the other hand, could be a phone call to a state election official with a demand to find votes to alter an election outcome. While made by a sitting president, a court could determine that this action serves a personal, electoral interest rather than a legitimate public or constitutional function, thus stripping it of any immunity. By creating this distinction but not applying it, the Supreme Court established a new and uncharted legal frontier. The ruling did not determine which of Donald Trump's alleged actions were official and which were private. Instead, it tasked the lower courts with this complex, fact-finding mission. This act of remanding the case with new instructions created a massive procedural hurdle. The trial court now bears the unprecedented responsibility of holding hearings to sift through evidence and categorize each action, a process guaranteed to consume months and fundamentally reshape the judicial timeline. To grasp the full impact of this ruling, we must move beyond the legal doctrine and examine the institutional mechanics at play. The United States Supreme Court does not function as a trial court or a jury. Its fundamental role is not to determine a defendant's guilt or innocence based on evidence. Instead, its primary responsibility is to interpret the Constitution and federal law, setting legal precedents and establishing the rules that all lower courts must follow. In the case of presidential immunity, the court was not judging Donald Trump's actions. It was defining the legal boundaries for his trial and for all future presidents. This distinction is critical. When the case arrived at the Supreme Court, the question was not, did Donald Trump conspire to overturn the election, but rather, can a former president be criminally prosecuted for acts committed while in office? This is a question of constitutional law, not of fact. The court's job was to set the guardrails, establishing a clear legal standard that could be universally applied. By focusing on the abstract legal principle of immunity, the court was operating squarely within its designated institutional role as the final arbiter of what the law means in the American system. The result of this process was the remand of the case. In the federal judicial system, a remand occurs when an appellate court, like the Supreme Court, sends a case back down to a lower court with specific instructions. This typically happens when the higher court establishes a new legal test or identifies an error in how the law was previously applied. The lower court is then tasked with re-evaluating the case's facts through the lens of the new legal framework. It is a procedural mechanism that ensures consistency and hierarchy within the judiciary. In this instance, the Supreme Court created the new official acts versus private acts distinction, but refrained from applying it to the specific allegations against Donald Trump. It remanded the case back to the trial court, presided over by Judge Tanya Chutkan, with the directive to conduct hearings and sort the evidence into these two categories. This decision illustrates the clear division of labor. The Supreme Court sets the legal rule, and the trial court applies that rule to the factual record. This process is methodical, deliberate, and by its very nature, time-consuming. This dynamic is a direct reflection of the federal judiciary's hierarchical structure. At the bottom are the district courts, which are the trial courts that handle evidence and determine facts. Above them are the circuit courts of appeals, which review the trial court's decisions for legal errors. At the apex is the Supreme Court, whose interpretations of the law are binding on all other courts. When the Supreme Court issues a ruling, it is not offering a suggestion. It is issuing a command that reshapes the legal landscape for every judge below it. This entire event serves as a textbook example of the principle of checks and balances, a cornerstone of the U.S. system of government. The separation of powers among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches is designed to prevent any single branch from accumulating too much power. Here, the judicial branch, through the Supreme Court, was directly engaged in defining the legal limits of the executive branch, embodied by the presidency. This function is not an anomaly. It is one of the most fundamental responsibilities of the federal courts in upholding the rule of law. The Supreme Court's decision, therefore, was an exercise in constitutional maintenance. It addressed the unresolved question of whether the president's power includes immunity from the nation's criminal laws. By rejecting absolute immunity, the court reaffirmed the principle that the executive is not above the law. However, by granting immunity for official acts, it also protected the functional independence of the presidency from politically motivated prosecutions that could paralyze its operations. This balancing act is a classic demonstration of the judiciary's role in mediating the inherent tensions between the different branches of government. The interplay between these institutions reveals how the system is designed to function, especially under pressure. The Supreme Court did not rush to a simple verdict, but instead created a complex legal standard. This standard, in turn, activated a specific procedural mechanism, the remand, which placed the burden of a lengthy factual inquiry on the trial court. This sequence of events was not a deviation from the norm, but a direct consequence of the judiciary's structure, where each level has a distinct and separate responsibility in the administration of justice. Ultimately, understanding the Supreme Court's role clarifies why the outcome was a procedural delay rather than a final judgment. The court fulfilled its institutional purpose by providing a legal answer to a constitutional question, not a factual resolution to a criminal indictment. It established the rules of the game and then handed the ball back to the trial court to play it out. This process, while frustrating for those seeking a swift conclusion, is a direct reflection of a system designed for deliberation and legal precision, where institutional roles are clearly and rigidly defined. Having established the legal standard and the institutional function of the Supreme Court, we can now trace the concrete, real-world consequences of this decision. The most immediate and significant impact was on the judicial calendar itself. The ruling effectively killed any possibility of Special Counsel Jack Smith's federal election interference case going to trial before the November 2024 presidential election. By remanding the case for lengthy fact-finding hearings on the nature of each alleged act, the court introduced a procedural delay so substantial that it pushed any potential verdict far beyond a critical political deadline. This outcome was not a matter of chance, but a direct result of the new legal test. The trial court is now mandated to hold a trial within a trial, meticulously sorting through evidence to categorize each of Donald Trump's actions as either an immune official act or a prosecutable private act. This process involves motions, arguments, and potential appeals, consuming months of court time. For those seeking a swift legal resolution, the Supreme Court's complex framework became an insurmountable procedural barrier, demonstrating how a ruling on abstract legal principles can have profound practical effects on the administration of justice. The subordination of the judicial timeline to the political clock carries immense weight. It means that American voters will now head to the polls without a definitive legal judgment on one of the most serious accusations ever leveled against a former president. The question of whether Donald Trump conspired to unlawfully remain in power will not be answered by a jury of his peers before the electorate decides whether to return him to that same office. This absence of a verdict fundamentally alters the information landscape of the 2024 election, leaving a critical matter of public accountability unresolved. The implications extend far beyond the trial schedule. The ruling creates a clear and consequential scenario dependent on the election's outcome. If Donald Trump wins the presidency in November, he will regain control of the executive branch, including the Department of Justice. As president, he would have the authority to appoint an attorney general, who could then be directed to dismiss all pending federal cases against him. This potential action would render the entire debate over his criminal liability and presidential immunity entirely moot, at least for the duration of his term in office. This power is a core feature of the American system of government. The president oversees the Department of Justice, which is responsible for all federal prosecutions. While norms have historically created a degree of separation between the White House and prosecutorial decisions, the ultimate authority rests with the head of the executive branch. A second Trump presidency could, therefore, end the federal cases not through a legal verdict in a courtroom, but through an executive action from the Oval Office, showcasing the direct intersection of political power and the judicial process at the highest level of government. Beyond the immediate fate of Donald Trump, the Supreme Court's decision establishes a lasting precedent that will shape the presidency for generations. All future presidents will now operate under this new two-tiered standard of immunity. The ruling carves a permanent line in the sand. Official acts are protected, but private acts, even those committed while holding the highest office, are subject to criminal prosecution. This precedent fundamentally redefines the legal boundaries of executive power, creating a new framework for accountability that did not exist in such explicit terms before this case reached the nation's highest court. This new legal landscape presents a dual legacy. On one hand, it could serve as a deterrent against future abuses of power, as presidents will be aware that actions deemed private or for personal gain could lead to criminal charges after they leave office. On the other hand, The ambiguity of the official versus private distinction could potentially open the door to a new era of politically motivated prosecutions. Future administrations might be tempted to frame the actions of their predecessors as private misconduct, using the new legal standard as a tool for political retribution, a concern central to the original arguments for broader immunity. In summary, the Supreme Court's ruling on presidential immunity is a study in paradox. Legally, it rejected Donald Trump's most expansive claim to power, affirming the foundational principle that no one, not even a president, is completely above the law. Yet in practical terms, the intricate legal solution it crafted, a time-consuming process of sorting official from private acts, delivered his single greatest strategic victory, a delay that pushed criminal accountability beyond the 2024 election. This outcome connects the legal machinery, the institutional process, and the real-world consequences into a single cohesive narrative of cause and effect. The final undeniable consequence is the realignment of justice and politics. The judicial calendar, once on a trajectory toward a pre-election verdict, was effectively subordinated to the political clock by the Supreme Court's intervention. The decision was not a simple win or loss, but a complex redrawing of the rules that fundamentally altered the context of the election. The ultimate impact was not on the abstract doctrine of immunity, but on the very tangible possibility of a legal resolution before voters were asked to deliver their own verdict at the ballot box.